Hello.
Coming, be welcome.
Hello.
Be welcome to our second Logic and Religion webinar. As you know, Professor Richard Swinburne is gonna speak today. Okay, so perhaps Jean-Yves Bizou is gonna say some few words before we start. Please, Jean-Yves.
Thank you, Ricardo. So, we are very happy to have this first talk because last month we had a general presentation of the webinar about the objective and the topic of the webinar, and today we have the first talk of this webinar by Professor Richard Swinburne from the University of Oxford. So we are really glad that he is talking today, and Dagana will be the chair of this session. So we have some problem of sounds, but I think, well, that's it. You know, I mean, we can start. And what is important, I think what is important in this webinar, like any webinar, is it's to have listening to some important scholar, and then to have a great discussion with him. And we are here people from all over the world, so I'm glad about that. Please.
Jai,
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Welcome everyone to our first or second, it depends how you look, but it's actually the first presentation, first lecture of the webinar series, Logic and Religion webinar series. And we have a special honor to present Professor Emeritus Richard Swinburne, who's here with us to present his paper with the same title as his newly published book, Are We Bodies or Souls? At this present moment, I'm going to kindly ask you to mute your microphones. We are many here in this room, so we can provide some good working space, good presenting space for our Professor Swinburne, so we can hear him well. I will take only a few minutes and I will give floor to Professor Swinburne. I don't think that I need to introduce him to you. You're probably very well aware of his work. He has been in the field of philosophy of religion, philosophy of science more than 50 years. He has published extensively. He's well known for his arguments of the existence of God, arguments for the existence of soul. Especially relevant to us today is the argument for personal identity, which is based on the concept of the soul. Can I ask you please to mute your microphones so we can hear each other well? I still hear some back sound. Okay, good. Okay, so as I said that Professor Swinburne published his book, Are We Bodies or Souls in 2019. He will be presenting us chapter 3 and chapter 4 as was announced. Here in the chat box, if you haven't received the link for the summary of the paper, you can still download it and have a look at it while Professor Swinburne is presenting. He will be presenting for 30-40 minutes or a little bit more if needed, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments. So Professor Swinburne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this opening webinar. I think people might find it helpful to follow the course of my lecture by having the summary in front of them, because then they will see the sequence of the argument. Okay, well, in this lecture, I'm going to present one argument from my book of the same name for the view that, as Plato and Descartes claimed, humans are essentially souls. We do, of course, have bodies, and they are vital for our well-being. But what makes us who we are is for each of us our individual soul. In this lecture, I approach this conclusion by discussing first different theories of personal identity. A theory of personal identity is a theory of what makes one person P2 at a later time T2 the same person as a person P1 at an earlier time T1. For example, what makes George accused in 2020 of having committed a murder in 1960, what makes him the same person as a person called George who committed that murder in 1960. The question is not as such the question of whether the later person has the same personality as the earlier person. Someone's personality, that is their character, is a matter of whether they are strong-willed, knowledgeable, intelligent, sympathetic, and so on. We say that someone's personality has changed if, that is, they, that is, the very same person, gains or loses some of these characteristics. But my question about personal identity is a question about whether a person is the same person as an earlier person, even if his or her personality has changed. One apparently obvious answer to this question is that P2 is the same person if and only if P2 has the same body. But how much of the same body? Surely, if someone has a heart transplant, they still continue to exist, but with a new heart. And similarly, for any transplant of any other bodily organ other than the brain. What makes the brain special is that our conscious life depends on the operation of our brains. We move our limbs only by causing some brain event, which causes the motion of our limbs. And we see and hear what is happening in the world only because light or sound waves cause changes in our eyes and ears, which cause brain events, which in turn cause our perceptual experiences. And our memories and character depend on the operation of our brain. Without the operation of our brain, we would not have any conscious experiences at all. So, perhaps the answer to our question is that P2 is the same person as P1, if and only if P2 has the same brain as P1. But again, the same question arises. How much of the same brain does P2 need in order to be the same person as P1? While most cells in most other parts of our body are replaced gradually over the course of 7 years or so by new cells, probably most brain cells, that is neurons, remain the same over the course of a normal human life. And that is perhaps an additional reason for taking our brain as what makes us who we are. But although natural processes may not need to lead to replacement of brain parts, surgical operations could do so. Surgeons often remove diseased parts of the brain. Although at present it's not possible for surgeons to remove a damaged brain part and transplant another brain part into it, this should become possible within the next century. Surgeons are only now just beginning to be able to reconnect severed spinal nerves, and so they are on the way to being able to connect a severed nerve to a new nerve obtained from elsewhere. And the nerves which connect brain parts with other brain parts are nerves of the same kind as spinal nerves. Hence, it should be possible for them to remove some brain part by severing the nerves which connected it to the rest of the brain and join the severed nerves to a part of the same kind taken from another brain. So, how much of someone's brain could be replaced before that person ceases to exist? One important fact about the brain which highlights this issue is this. The brain consists of two cerebral hemispheres, left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and also a lower part, the cerebellum. Our conscious life depends on the upper part of the cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex. Patients suffering from otherwise incurable epilepsy due to a malfunctioning hemisphere sometimes have parts of one hemisphere removed and may even have the whole hemisphere removed in an operation called an anatomical hemispherectomy. What happens then is that most of the functions of that part, or of the whole hemisphere, are taken over by another part, or by the other hemisphere, and the patient thinks and behaves in much the same way as before, except, of course, for not having epileptic fits. Behaves in the same way as before, at least in the respect that their memories remain largely the same and their character is not very different. And this is the case whichever of the two hemispheres is removed, which shows that there is some very considerable overlap between the brain states of the two hemispheres, which gives rise to conscious memories and character. So suppose when one of the hemispheres is removed from one person, let's call him John, and it is replaced by a hemisphere transplanted from the brain of a different person, James, then it is to be expected that the resulting person will have some of the memories and aspects of character deriving from the experiences of James, as well as the ones which John had previously. So, is the resulting person John or James, or neither of these? If you think that the answer is that the resulting person is John because he still has most of John's brain, then consider a more radical surgical operation in which both hemispheres are removed from a different person, whom I will call Alexandra, and also from two other persons, whom I will call Alex and Sandra. Alexandra's left hemisphere is then connected to Alex's brain, and Alexandra's right hemisphere is connected to Sandra's brain. Then, both of two subsequent persons would have equal claims to be Alexandra, and there would seem no possible subsequent experiment which could show which, if any, of Alexandra, Alex or Sandra, was still alive. The theories of personal identity prevalent in the English-speaking world of the last few centuries have been of three kinds: physical theories, or mental equals psychological theories, or mixed theories. A physical theory analyzes P1 being the same person as P2 being the same person as P1 in terms of having all or some of the same body or brain as P1. A mental theory analyzes P2 being the same person as P1 in terms of P2 having many largely true memories of the actions of P1 and a similar character to P1. These memories and character of P2 being causally dependent on those of P1. A mixed theory contains elements of both physical and mental theories. Faced with the difficulties which I have described, any physical theory has to tell us how much of the body or brain of P1 P2 needs to have in order to have P1's body or brain. A mental theory needs to tell us how many of the memories of P1's experiences P2 needs to have, and how similar to P1 P2's character needs to be in order for P2 to be P1. And a mixed theory needs us to tell us what combination of brain parts and memories would make P2 identical to P1. All of these theories are what is known as complex theories. Complex in that P2 being the same person as P1 is to be analyzed in terms of a certain degree of continuity of one or more separate features of P2 with those of P1. P2's brain would be continuous with the brain of P1 to the extent to which any replacement of parts of P1's brain is gradual, and P2's memory and character are continuous with those of P1 to the degree to which any loss of memory is gradual, being gradually replaced by new memories of more recent experiences. For example, you could have one detailed brain theory of personal identity, which might have the continuity requirement that P1 is the same as P2 P2 is the same as P1 if and only if over any period of 5 years separating them, no more than 10% of P1's brain has been replaced by a part taken from the brain of some other person. So P1 would be the same person as P2. Sorry, I should phrase it the other way around. So P2 would be the same person as P1 if after 5 years, only 9% of P1's brain has been replaced, but not if 11% of P1's brain has been replaced. A detailed memory will need to specify whether there needs to be a chain of intermediate persons between P1 and P2, such that there's only one person, P1 star at T1 star, immediately after T1, whose memories and character are almost the same as those at P1, and then another person, P1 double star at T1 double star, whose memories and character are almost the same as those at P1 star, and so on until we get to P2. The two persons would be the same if there's a chain of intermediate persons, each causally dependent on the earlier person and having very small changes of memory between them. Or the theory might allow gaps in the chain, and the theory would need to specify just how many memories and how much character needs to be how similar to those of the preceding instant for the succession to guarantee that P2 is P1. A mixed theory typically specifies that there must be continuity of memory and character between P2 and P1 caused by brain continuity. And again, in order to be a precise theory, it needs to fill in the details. All such complex theories are open to one substantial objection, the arbitrariness objection. It does seem highly arbitrary to suppose that P2 is the same as P1, only if more than 10% of P1's brain has been replaced over 5 years, but not P1 if more than 10% has been replaced. The same objection will go for any other brain theory which contains different numbers. For example, no more than 10% in one operation, or no more than 15% over 3 years, or whatever. It seems highly arbitrary to suppose that P2 is the same as P1, only if he can remember, to take a memory example, only if he can remember at least 5% of P1's experiences after 5 years. For no conceivable experiment could show which of these theories is correct. All that an experiment could show is that P2 had such and such brain matter and had such and such memories and character. But the issue is whether the person who did have such and such brain matter and such memories of character is P1, and there could not be the slightest reason for preferring any one detailed theory, which some philosopher might offer, over a slightly different one. But which is the right theory is a very important matter, which will rightly influence human decisions. Consider the case of a patient who has a serious brain disease, which can be cured only not merely by removing a certain part of the brain, but by replacing it with a part obtained from another brain. Before the patient agrees to undergo the operation, the patient will need to know whether they are likely to survive the operation. A neuroscientist might be able to tell the patient whether the operation is likely to be successful, in the sense that after the operation there will be a living conscious person. And the neuroscientist might be able to tell the patient how much of their past memory the subsequent person will have, and perhaps whether the subsequent person will have a similar character to the present one. But unless he or she has access to a true philosophical theory of personal identity, the neuroscientist will not be able to tell the patient whether they will survive the operation. Many of such complex theories are also open to a second objection, the more than one candidate objection. I mentioned earlier the possibility of an operation in which both hemispheres are removed from one person, Alexandra, and also from the other two persons, Alex and Sandra. Alexandra's left hemisphere is then connected to Alex's brain, and Alexandra's right hemisphere is connected to Sandra's brain. Then, on a theory which claims that in order to be P1, that is to say, in order to be Alexandra, a subsequent person needs only to have 10% of P1's brain and to be able to remember 5% of the past experiences of P1. And in that case, both of the subsequent persons would be Alexandra. But that's not possible, since they now have quite independent lives and think quite different thoughts from each other. So many complex theories have this more than one person candidate difficulty. Not all such theories have this difficulty. This objection does not apply to theories which demand a great deal of continuity and connectedness between P1 and P2, for then it would only be possible for one later person to have that degree of continuity. For example, only one later person could have 60% of P1's brain. I'll omit the rest of that paragraph. It is because of the continuity between persons who have less and less of the brain matter of some person, P1, and less of the memories and character of P2, that most of those who advocate complex theories of personal identity have now moved to a theory of personal identity which reflects that continuity. This is a theory of partial identity. The word partial identity to describe these theories is mine, but that is in effect their nature. The claim is that the less and less of P1's brain matter and or memories and character a subsequent person P2 has, and the less and less gradual is the process by which the change occurred, the less is the identity of the subsequent person P2 with P1. Among the eminent philosophers who have advocated such a theory are Robert Nozick, David Lewis, and Derek Parfit. Nozick described later persons who evolve causally from earlier persons as being their continuous. Lewis wrote of personal identity as a matter of degree of a relation of continuity and connectedness, which he calls the R relation. Parfit wrote of later persons being to different degrees survivors of the earlier person, to the extent to which they have physical and mental continuity and connectedness with them. For all these writers, the facts which a theory of personal identity needs to describe is the extent of such continuity and connectedness, which is in effect the partial identity of a person with an earlier person. According to these philosophers, to call a future person really identical with a past person is to use an imprecise ordinary language term to describe the case where some person has a very great degree, perhaps the maximum degree, of such continuity and connectedness with a past person, and, as Nozick insisted, a greater degree of continuity and connectedness with that person than with other persons. Advocates of these partial identity theories, just to repeat, partial identity says the later person to the extent to which they have some of the brain and some of the memories and character is to that extent the same person, only partially so. Advocates of these theories point out that the identity of a later inanimate physical object with an earlier one is a matter of degree. A later table is naturally described as being partly the same as an earlier table, if it is made only of some of the parts of the earlier table. For example, if it has all the legs of the earlier table but a different tabletop. The facts in virtue of which we might say that a later table is totally the same, partly the same, or hardly the same, are the degree of continuity of its parts with those of the earlier table. It has greater continuity with the earlier table if it has most of the parts of the earlier table, and so is more identical to it than it would be if it had only a few parts of the earlier table. Why, say Parfit and others, why should we not say that the same about persons, perhaps taking into account the continuities of their memories and character as well as of their brain matter? There is, however, an enormous difference between persons and inanimate things such as tables, in that the earlier person being identical with a later person entails that the earlier person is going to experience the experiences of the later person. Inanimate things do not have experiences, and so their identity can rightly be analyzed in terms of the continuity and perhaps connectedness. I have used this word connectedness, sorry, an aside, is Parfit's word, and Parfit divides what I have called continuity into two parts. Continuity is the gradual connection of the later person with the earlier person. Connectedness is the degree of similarity of the resulting person with the earlier person. But I've, as it were, amalgamated these terms just to describe continuity as a matter of, firstly, gradual change, and secondly, similarity of the resulting product to the earlier product. Right, to continue. If personal identity is ultimately a matter of the degree of continuity between successive persons, it must give an account in terms of that continuity of why and when a person has reason to fear the bad experiences and to hope for the good experiences of any person who is a close continuer or survivor. Presumably, such a theory must say that a person has more reason to fear or hope for the experiences of a future person, to the extent to which that future person is a close continuer of themselves. But that leads to what I regard as a conclusive objection to any such partial identity theory. While only some of the complex theories which I discussed earlier, which entail that any future person either definitely is or definitely isn't identical to the earlier person, while only some of those complex theories are open to the more than one candidate objection, all partial identities theories are open to a form of this objection. On any theory on which continuing to exist is a matter of degree, it's always possible for the earlier person, P1, to have more than one continuer or whatever, although one of them may be a closer continuer than another. For example, if P2 has only 70% of P1's brain, then the remaining 30% can be given to P2 star. And so while P2 is a close continuer of P1, P2 star is also a continuer, although a less close one. But since they are both continuous, then P1 will be going to have, to different degrees, both the experiences of P2 and the experiences of P2 star. So if P1 knows in advance what is going to happen to his brain, and also knows that P2 is going to have a happy life, and P2 star is going to have a miserable life, then P1 must expect to have a life that is partly happy and partly miserable, although of course more happy than miserable because P2 is a closer continuer than P2 star. But what can that mean, that he's going to have a life that's partly happy, partly miserable? Because no future person is going to have such a life. Each future person is either going to be totally happy or totally miserable. P2 and P2 star are going to have quite different lives, and neither of their lives will include a mixture of happiness and misery. So perhaps the suggestion is that as with tables, part of P1 is going to have a happy life, and part of P1 is going to have a miserable life. But experiences are properties of persons, not properties of parts of persons. Well, part of my brain may be the cause of me hearing a sound, and part of my brain may be the cause of me feeling pain. It is I who co-experience both the sound and the pain. It cannot be the case that one part of me looks forward with pleasure to P2's experiences, and a different part of me looks forward with fear to P2 star's experiences. There's only one me at the earlier time, and that one me is pictured as looking forward to both. So the partial identity of both P2 and P2 star with P1 cannot consist in P1 being identical with one part, P2 being identical with one part of P1, and P2 star being identical with a different part of P1. For these reasons, it seems impossible to make sense of the notion of a future person being partly identical to an earlier person. Degree of continuity of brain or memories cannot be what personal identity consists in. All of these difficulties arise, of course, from the fact that you can have different amounts of brain and different degrees of continuity of memories and so on. And that's the feature, the general characteristic of complex theories. So my conclusion is that no complex theory can possibly analyze what it is for one person to be identical with a later person, because no such theory can analyze what it is for an earlier person to be about to have the experiences which some later person is going to have. It simply isn't enough for there to be any degree of continuity between the experiences of the earlier and later persons. In contrast to complex theories, a simple theory, as it's called, claims that personal identity cannot be analyzed in terms of any properties or substances of which there can be different degrees or quantities, since, for the reasons which I have given, personal identity is all or nothing. Each person is or is not the same person as an earlier person, and there's no intermediate possibility. Certainly, the greater the continuity and connectedness between P1 and P2 of brain, memory, and character, the more probable it is that P2 is P1. But this continuity is only probabilistic evidence of personal identity, and the personal identity is itself something different from that continuity. Just as a footprint in the sand makes it probable that someone walked there, but someone having walked there is something quite different from there being a footprint in the sand. But then in what does personal identity consist? Why not just say that it is ultimate and unanalyzable, and that P2 being the same as P1 cannot be analyzed further? Why not just say that either P1 is the same person as P2, or P1 is the same person as P2 star, and these are just unanalyzable truths, even if we cannot know which one is the true one. The problem with this is that it is incompatible with a highly plausible principle, which I call the principle of the identity of composites, which I will now explain. This is on your handout, and you may need to follow word by word as I state it. A substance is a thing which has properties, a component of the world, and it may or may not have other substances as part. Thus, the Milky Way, my house, my desk, and each of the atoms of which my desk is made are all substances. They all have properties, including properties of shape, mass, volume, color, and the like. Now, persons are substances. The principle of the identity of composites states, quote, if a substance exists for a certain period of time and has certain properties, and has certain substances which also have certain properties as its parts, arranged in a certain way, all with a certain history, then it is not possible, logically possible, that if these parts exist in the same arrangement, having had the same properties for the same period of time, it's not logically possible that they could constitute a different substance from the ones which they do form. Consider a certain car, C1, parked at a certain time in a car park. It has many different parts, engine, wheels, seats, and so on, arranged in a certain way. The car has had a certain history, during which it has gained or lost various properties and parts. Each of its parts has had a certain history, during which the part has gained and lost various properties. Now, is it possible that instead of this car, there could be instead a different car, C2? Instead of C1, there could be C2, parked in the same place at that same time, which was made of all the same parts, arranged in just the same way, parts which had all the same properties as C1 at each moment at the same time as C1 did, and yet it's a different car. It doesn't make sense to suppose this. The history and properties of the car and the history and properties of its parts fully determine which car it is. It's simply not compatible with all that I have described being the same, that C2 could be a different car from C1. Now, reconsider the earlier example of P2, for example, Alex, being formed of the parts of and having the same of the memories, having some of the memories and experience of the experiences of P1, Alexandra. I repeat that. Now consider the earlier example of P2, for example, Alex, being formed of some of the parts of and having some of the memories of the experiences of P1, Alexandra. A person is a substance. So, by the principle of the identity of composites, any person, P2 star, formed of exactly the same parts obtained from P1 as P2, including brain parts, arranged in the same way as these parts, having had the same properties and history as those of P2, and having had exactly the same memories of P1's experiences as does P2, and exactly the same degree of similarity of character to P1 as does P2, would be P2. So considering, could there be, after the transplant or whatever has occurred, could there, and there's you've got a person P2, could it be the case that you still had, it was still indeterminate whether the person was P2 or whether the person was Alexandra or whether the person wasn't Alexandra? All these changes have been done. Surely there's got to be an answer. Either it is Alexandra or it isn't Alexandra. It follows that if the only parts of P2, that is the only parts of Alex, are physical parts, and it and the parts have had a certain past history, including having had certain past experiences, then it would not be possible for P2 still to be either P1 or not P1. If you consider the actual subsequent person, and then could there be a different person instead of that person who has all the same parts and all the same memories, etc., as the actual person? And that is ruled out by the principle which I have tried to justify. The principle of the identity of composites does not determine whether P2 is P1, but it does follow from that principle that either it's a logical consequence of its past history and all its parts that it is P1, or it's a logical consequence of its past history that it's not P1. And that follows if the only parts it has are physical parts. described an experiment where what's happened is that there's been a degree of continuity, it doesn't matter what it is, in respect of brain matter, and a degree of continuity in respect of memory and character. And if the principle of the identity of composites is true, then once you know all that, then that determines who the subsequent person is. But given this simple theory for which I have argued, the physical parts and their properties, mental and physical, of P2, that is Alex, may be quite insufficient to determine whether P2 is or is not P1, Alexandra. In this situation, it's not possible to determine merely on the basis of the physical parts and so on, whether the subsequent person is or is not Alexandra. But if the principle of the identity of composites is true, then it must be possible to determine this. And since all the parts we've taken into account so far are the physical parts, and with their physical properties and mental properties, the only difference that remains is that the part must be, which makes all the difference, a non-physical part. There must be another part that makes the difference, otherwise there wouldn't be a difference and we'd know the answer. So, but none of the physical parts or their properties or the mental properties determine the answer. So there must be something else that determines the answer, and this something else must be a non-physical part, because that's all that's left. And it must be an indivisible part, since if it was divisible, the problems discussed above would reappear in the form of the problem of what proportion of that part would be necessary for P2 to be P1. This non-physical, indivisible part is what we call P1 soul. And given that there is a person, P2, who has P1 soul, any suggestion that physical parts or mental or physical properties are also necessary in order for P2 to P1 would be open to those same difficulties about what proportion of these features would be necessary, which were the ruin of complex theories discussed earlier. Hence, I conclude that if there is a person P2 who has P1 soul, then that person P2 is P1. And if a person P2 does not have P1 soul, then P2 is not P1. Normally, no doubt, when there are no large brain transplants or amnesia, our soul goes where our brain goes. But in the puzzle situations, no one can know where our soul goes. Nevertheless, in all circumstances, our soul determines who we are. Now, briefly to apply all that to the religion part of Lara, I now suggest that the theory that we are our souls, which is a theory accepted in much Eastern religion, is also essential for the major Western religions which believe in life after death, and in particular for Christianity. It is a central Christian doctrine that the dead will be raised again at the general resurrection as embodied humans. But the dead bodies of humans are often burnt in a crematorium and turned into chunks of energy. The chunks of energy is just the chunk it is, in virtue of how much energy it contains. There is nothing to distinguish the chunk of energy produced by burning one dead body from the chunk produced by burning a different dead body. And so, if a particular person P1 is to be raised in the general resurrection, there must be some further essential non-physical and indivisible part of that person which survives the crematorium fire and is reunited with the body in the general resurrection, and that is their soul. So the conclusion of this paper, that it is necessary for the identity of each of us that we have a soul which makes us who we are, is one essential for Christian doctrine. It is also a normal Catholic and Orthodox doctrine, and that of many Protestants, that each human, or at least an essential part of each human, continues to live between their death and the general resurrection without their body, and is reunited with the body in the general resurrection. If the view for which I have been arguing, and which I develop more fully in Are We Bodies or Souls, is correct, then this doctrine must be understood as the doctrine that not merely does an essential part of us continue to exist between death and the general resurrection, but that all that is essential to us continues to exist. And so each of us continues to exist during this period. That is, it denies Aquinas's famous claim, anima non est ego. The saints whose bodies lie in the ground really are in heaven. It's not just merely that some essential part of them is in heaven. But while affirming that all that a human needs in order to exist is that their soul should exist, I do not deny that a human needs their body in order to flourish. For if we have a body, we can make a difference to the world and interact with other people. A body gives us a public place by affecting which and being affected by which we become part of the public world. I interact with someone else by using my body to grasp their body, or to make a sound which will affect their ears, or to write a letter which they will read with their eyes, and by allowing them to affect me by affecting my body in similar ways. Barring some miracle, a soul without a body would be a very lonely and impotent thing. It needs a miracle for the saints to interact with us or each other. Hence the goodness of the Christian good news that our resurrection will be a bodily resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Swinburne. Are there any questions or comments?
Or objections?
Yes.
I have a question. Oh, okay, someone else is raising his hand. So
Let me see.
Well, I don't know how to raise my hand. How to raise a hand?
There is
Perhaps it would be best if anyone has any questions about what I meant by anything.
Yes.
First, before we
you can ask a question, yes, without raising your hand.
Okay, so if I may, first of all,
yes, please.
Thank you for an extremely interesting talk. And maybe I have got a question and a comment. You were talking about personal identities. So the question is, what about DNA code? DNA code could be explicated as something as a unique algorithm that uniquely determines the identity of our composition, but I mean mereology of abstract entities, not of physical entities, of course. That's a question. And then a comment or...
May I answer that before you come to the comment?
Yeah.
There may be a causal relation between our DNA and our continuing, but what I am concerned in this paper is what it is for some person to be me. And what it is for some person to be me isn't for me to have a certain DNA, because it was an empirical discovery of a correlation between two separate things, that two individuals who have the same DNA are the same person. Of course, that's a slight exaggeration, because in fact, two persons can have the same DNA, but we could amplify that to see DNA plus this, that, and the other. these are separate things. Causally, they may be connected, but that's not what the paper is about. It's not about the causes of somebody continuing to exist. It's about what it consists in. And that doesn't consist in having the same DNA, because these are separate things whose connection we have established independently. We could have found it doesn't exist.
Okay, thank you very much. And the other question, well, I fully agree with your conclusion that the soul, our soul, is the substance or the most important. But is there any connection between soul and consciousness? Because as we all know, consciousness is a mystery for science, and soul. Well, okay, we Christians believe that we have soul and that the soul survives, etc. So, what's the relation, or is there something in common between soul and consciousness?
Well, consciousness is a property of the soul. It's not a thing. It's being conscious is something that substances have, persons have. Robots probably don't. It's our soul is the part of us which is conscious, because our hope to survive is a hope that we will have experiences. It's not a hope that we'll have a body, though we may hope that as well. But hoping to survive is a hope that we will continue to exist, and our existing must consist in our having experiences. Otherwise, it wouldn't, or capacity for experiences. Otherwise, it wouldn't be us. So there's every connection.
Because you most probably know that book, Proof of Heaven, written by that neuroscientist Eben, I believe is his name, and his brain was actually completely destroyed, and yet he survived. But he remembered that he was conscious during that state when his brain didn't function at all, and he believed that he was conscious. So there must be some substantial connection, I believe, between soul and consciousness.
Well, yes, I was claiming that the soul is necessary for consciousness. And of course, what I'm claiming is that it's logically necessary for consciousness, because if whatever happens to the bits of us and to our memories, our survival doesn't consist in what happens to the bits of us and our memories. So it must consist of something else. The something else must be non-material and indivisible. And we wouldn't survive unless we had the capacity for consciousness. That's what our surviving consists in. So it must be a property of that part. And that is a logical argument. Of course, one's always grateful for examples from physics, and in this case, psychophysics. But I think it would be a pity to rely too heavily on such examples, since I'm sure there are people in the literature who have said, no, that his brain was really partly operative, we don't know, etc., etc. That would not affect my sort of argument.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for very interesting talk and answers. Thank you.
Okay, now we have Jan.
Okay, so I have one objection, because I think that there is one very problematic assumption in your talk, namely that soul is not complex and it doesn't change. Of course, I understand that from theological point of view, it is okay, but empirically speaking, this assumption is not stable. And if you look at mental faculties of persons, it is rather very dubious. I give you one example. Perhaps my teacher, Roman Ingarden, had a very, very faithful student, Andrzej Półtaski, who died quite recently, and he was over 90. And he was very, very competent knower of Ingarden's soul. And one journalist came to him in this year as the beginning, just before his death, and asked him, can you tell me something about Professor Ingarden? And he answered, who is Ingarden? So what happened? So I think that his mental faculties changed. Once again, I don't object that from theological point of view, your criticism of naturalistic approach to personal identity is correct. However, positive solution is based on a very, very non-evident assumption.
Yes, your main point was that the soul itself might be divisible, right?
No, I have no positive.
Is that your claim?
I only would like to know justification for assumption that soul, whatever it is not complex and it doesn't change. For example, we have.
Yes, okay. I get the point.
So on,
sure. My argument for its indivisibility was that suppose it was divisible, then in that case it could be divided. And it could be divided so that, once again, there would be two candidates with equal, and one of them could have one part of the soul, the other could have the other part of the soul, with equal claim to be the earlier person. And then my arguments would come in again, saying, well, what has the earlier person to look forward to if they if each of these later persons who has half their soul are going to have different experiences, because there is no one person at the later time who will have both of the experiences. What's wrong with all the complex theories is that what they think claim constitutes personal identity is divisible, and hence the need for the soul arises from the need for indivisibility. There's got to be an answer to which person is me and which isn't, at least so my argument goes, and therefore the soul itself must be indivisible.
Okay. Now we have Ruud.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor Swinburne. I agree with your conclusion, but I don't think the argument from personal identity works. And it's relatively simple. On the one hand, we say a person, say Alex, must have an indivisible, non-physical part, that is a soul. So Alex has a soul. At the same time, we're asking, are we bodies or are we souls? And we say, no, we are souls, which means that Alex has a soul, and Alex is a soul. And I think that is strange because that leads to the conclusion that Alex has Alex. To have a soul and to be a soul seem incompatible to me.
Well, my claim is that the soul is the essential part of me, the one and only essential part of me, and therefore necessary, and having that part is a necessary and sufficient condition for being me. I agree that perhaps ordinary language, the expression has a soul, suggests that there is something independent of the soul which has it. But in logical parlance, my claim is that the soul is the one and only essential part of me. And by itself, it constitutes me. Just as, take a different sort of example, suppose you have the American Fifth Fleet. The American Fifth Fleet might be the fleet it is in virtue of its flagship, whatever it's called, the USS Roosevelt. And what makes the fleet that fleet is that it has that flagship. Now, it may have a few other members as well, but those members are also members of the American Fifth Fleet, but they're not essential ones, and that is my claim. So if ordinary language is a bit puzzling in this respect, okay, but I think I've made clear what I am saying by has a soul is that the soul is the one and only essential part of me.
Yes, I expected that kind of answer.
Good. Means you understood my point.
You're trying to have your cake and eat it. Either the person has a soul or the soul has a person. And I think
so is the person. So is the person.
Second one.
And the person.
Okay, thank you anyway.
Okay, now we have Parmar.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne. Am I audible?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, suppose at conception, a single human-celled embryo is formed. Does it have a soul? If no, then when does the soul enter the embryo? Because it has all the genetic information of a person. If yes, then if the cell divides and subsequently suppose it divides into two and two cells give rise to identical twins, are they sharing a single soul? And if we take this idea forward and suppose in future we invent a machine that makes an exact replica of a person, then suppose a person is replicated by such a machine, would the two people who are created have one soul or they would have different souls? Thank you, sir.
Okay, several questions there. When does the soul come into existence? Well, to many of the points, the questions you have asked, I do not know the answer, but it is not important to my paper what the answer is, because either answer will satisfy the demands of this paper. Now, modern Catholic view seems to be that we ought to assume the soul comes into existence at the same time as the fertilized egg. But I can't see any reason to believe that. And I can't see much reason in Christian tradition, actually, for believing that. Aquinas said that at its first stage, the fetus was a vegetable, and at its second stage, it was an animal, and it only became a person at a later stage. I forget just how many days. He got that idea from Aristotle. I forget how many days, but it was something like 90 days. only it was a bit longer for women than for men. I only mentioned that to point out that the modern Catholic assumption that we are killing a person if we destroy a fertilized embryo might be true, but I can't see any justification in tradition or anything else for believing it. The only grounds of a non-dogmatic kind for believing that there is a soul arises when we believe that there is a conscious being. Because when the moment there is a conscious being, the question can arise as to whether a later person is or is not that same as that person, the question will be answered by saying, does the later person experience, is the earlier person the same person as the person who has the later experiences? But when there's no person having experiences, I can't see any reason for supposing that they have a soul. And I think modern science suggests it's somewhere about the 6 months of conception that goings on in the brain are rather similar to goings on in our brain when we are conscious. So that would be my answer, but it could be mistaken. Maybe the soul's there earlier, but that's the only one for which I can see adequate justification. So all your suppositions about early egg splitting would not then be relevant.
Right. Yeah. But suppose we invent a machine that replicates a person in every way, then what? Do the two people have the same soul?
Well, they can only have the same soul if they are the same person. And they are the same person if and only if what the one thinks the other is thinking, and what the one is intending the other is intending, and so on. And that it can only be the same person if necessarily that is the case. Now, in this sort of split case, there are two possible scenarios. One is that really it is the same person. Now, what that means is that there is just one subject of consciousness, and the person has two bodies. Yes, I can make sense of that. It's possible that as it were, we could have a body over there that we was able to operate with merely by thinking. And that would be a case of one person, two bodies. But I think that a rather unlikely scenario, and because it is surely possible once the cloning has been done, as it is with all other animal cloning, that the one person has different experiences or could have different experiences from the other one. And in that case, there are two persons and two souls.
Right. But at the point of separation, they were one person. But after replication, there are two people. So has the soul divided?
No, the soul can't divide, given my argument. But one of the persons may have survived, and the other is a new person.
But we don't know which is original.
No, we don't know. I don't profess you to know all the answers to these scientific questions. Indeed, it is the fact that we cannot discover the answers to these scientific questions, and yet there is a question here that is the motivation behind this paper. It's the fact we wouldn't know whether which person was the later person, and yet there's got to be a truth, given my argument about which person is the later person, but that's not a matter for science to discover.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, now we have Ali. Ali's question.
Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne, for your nice lecture. Well, my question is about certain experiments in neuroscience that show that under influence of certain drugs or under certain conditions, you lose your notion of self. And they conclude that maybe the notion of I or self is a delusion in some sense. And in certain religious traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism, you see the same argument that self is just a delusion and actually an emergent phenomena in some sense that doesn't actually exist, but you would imagine that it exists under certain condition that a complex system such as a brain can perceive. So assuming that this argument holds and self is a delusion, does it hurt any part of your argument about the relation between soul and body? And can soul exist with the existence of self itself? Thanks.
The kind of evidence you mention is no evidence at all that the soul is an illusion. It is evidence that certain messings around with the brain or certain experiences can lead people to believe that they don't have a soul. Whether they do have a soul is independent of whether they have been caused to believe this by that process or any other process. It's a matter of a rational argument of a different kind. I mean, we can be caused to believe anything by a process of brainwashing, but the fact we've been caused to have a belief by a certain route doesn't show the belief is false, and it doesn't show it's true. That has to be investigated by other means. Now, sure, people can be persuaded that they don't lose their sense of self. But if my argument is correct, this is just a very unfortunate delusion that they have been inculcated in, and likewise, I am afraid, with Buddhism.
Okay, now we have Wesley.
Thank you very much.
So it appears to me that whatever physical component there may be of me and or my body is distinct from a microbe living in my gut. Nevertheless, there is ample experimental evidence that my gut microbiome does influence a significant part of what I would call me. There are certainly connections to various mood conditions, possibly autism spectrum disorders, things like this. So there is some influence of something which is not me physically on me. It appears that this dependence would challenge the application of composite identity to persons, because somehow my identity, if physical, would depend on something which is physically distinct from me. Be interested to hear your response to this challenge.
All you pointed out quite correctly is that there is body-soul interaction. I certainly maintain that going on all the time. Our thoughts are influenced by what happens in our brain, which are influenced by what happens in our gut, and so on. And conversely, if I decide to wave my arm, this causes my brain to do something which causes my arm to move. This is a causal link between, given my paper, two separate things. And of course, in our life on Earth, we are dependent on that causal link. But my point is that the causal link is not what makes us who we are. It's a causal link between two things which are what they are in virtue of different considerations. The mere fact that the goings on in my body are causally necessary for my soul to exist doesn't show that my soul couldn't exist in another way if a different cause could be found to keep it in existence. My paper is only designed to show what our existence consists in, not what is causally necessary for it to be there.
It would be very strange, though, a soul must be a very strange sort of thing if its essence is independent of any causal forces that have acted upon it.
Why would that be strange?
Well, it would, for instance, have no connection with any instruction it's ever been given, down to any name that might have been attached to it or any belief it might hold, because all of those arise from causal forces. It would have no connection to any emotional responses or experiences it would have had. Those are all causal forces.
Really? No, I don't see that at all. Of course, body and soul are very closely connected. There's interaction all the time, and but I mean, interaction must be interaction between different things. This table lamp I have here, this computer I have here, it is what it is, independent of what has caused it. It's what it is, and some things just are what they are. And that's how it is. But of course, I'm not denying that it's the brain and our body that keeps our soul in existence on Earth. Yes, of course, yes. But if it's a separate thing, then something else could keep it in existence if our body didn't.
Thank you.
Hey, Ricardo, please. Now you can ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne, for the lecture. I have a very specific question about your argument. It's really very specific, but it's related to a concept that I think it's quite important for your argument, the concept of logical possibility. You use it in your principle of identity of composites and elsewhere. But I have a question about the principle of identity of composites. You say that it's a highly plausible principle. I tried to somehow justify it, and I have to confess that your use of the term logically possible makes it a bit hard for me to justify it. So I found a justification, and I want you to tell me if I'm right or wrong. I found a justification by replacing it with conceivable. So I do agree with you. It's really plausible if if instead of using logically possible, not logically possible, we use not conceivable. Then it seems to me a very plausible principle. But then we have to try to justify this inference from conceivability to possibility. And if we do that, it seems that we are going to use that part of the relation between possibility and conceivability, which is the most controversial part, that says that everything that is possible is also conceivable. Then if you use modus tollens, you conclude that everything that is not conceivable is not possible. Then you reach the form of your principle. So, but if I'm right in this reconstruction, then you have to justify the claim that everything that is possible is also conceivable, which I think is something very hard to do.
I think I can do it. Well, first, of course, one must analyze what one means by conceivable. I suspect you know David Chalmers's work, do you at all? Yeah. And he distinguishes between prima facie conceivable, what we think we can make sense of, from ideally conceivable, what really does make sense. And I'm happy with that. And I think one can infer from the one to the other. Given we're talking about ideal conceivability, that is conceivability after put it one way, but by an ideally rational being, or conceivability which couldn't be overthrown by any later discovery, then I do equate a logical possibility with conceivability, and I take prima facie conceivability as evidence of ideal conceivability. Now that gets down back to what we mean by logical possibility, and in my view, logic is simply the system of rules either invented arbitrarily or invented to codify ordinary language, which determines what you are committed to by one sentence and what doesn't make sense. That is to say, the reason why nothing can be read and not colored is simply because we use the word colored and the word red in such a way that we couldn't understand something being read and not being colored. And therefore, logical entailment is simply drawing out what you're committed to by a sentence. And if a sentence is such that however you go on drawing out from it, you never get any sentence that makes no sense, then it's logically possible. But if you do get a sentence that makes no sense, then it's not logically possible. And given all that apparatus, then my principle of the identity of composites, for example, depends on look at this example, my car example. We can't make sense of what it is for to have the two different cars which have all the same parts and all the same history and so on and so forth. And it's therefore showing that it's not logically possible, because when we spell it out, it doesn't make any sense. We can't understand, and given not because of a lack of immediate understanding, but because we can't simply see how it could be like that. And it seems to entail a contradiction. And so, given all that, that's my justification for the principle. It makes no sense to suppose that it doesn't operate in this case. So, the principle works, and therefore I apply it to persons.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I would like to take a few minutes to read some of the questions from the chat.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have, because some of the audience does not have a microphone or a camera, so just facilitate that for several minutes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Jack Cody wrote a question for a chat. Is the soul here to be taken as a mental essence or irreducible substance realized via the brain?
It's a non-physical substance. It's caused to exist by the development of the fetus, ultimately throwing it up at some stage, possibly put in view of what I said earlier, maybe after 6 months of pregnancy. That's what it is, and it's non-physical, and it's the sort of thing that has experiences, can perform try to make bodily movements and so on. That's what it is, and it's conscious some of the time, can be conscious. I'm not committed to it always will be conscious, but it can be switched on easily by doing things to the body. Do you think that answers his question?
Okay, yes. Also, there is a question from Luigi. He says that I may agree that we are all souls, but I do not understand how souls do not die with the bodies.
Well, maybe they do, and nothing in this paper has attempted to show that they don't. It's just attempted to show that it's logically possible that they don't. But that's stage one towards showing that they survive. My only grounds for believing that they survive are provided by the Christian doctrine, which itself has, of course, grounds. And in particular, the resurrection of Jesus is evidence of continuity despite a dead body. But it requires a lot of complicated argument to show that Jesus was God incarnate, he rose from the dead, he founded a church which can be relied on, and so on, before we can believe that what is logically possible in this case, that we survive, is actually true. But so all that this argument purports to show is that it's logically possible and that there's no contradiction in traditional doctrines.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Jack. He makes a comment just to follow on from Jan. If the soul is taken as unchanging, then does it not follow that the essence of self relative to experience, action within the world, is to some extent predetermined? Again, just a chat comment. Thank you for the talk. It was excellent.
No, I don't think that follows. I haven't mentioned free will, and I think it's quite a difficult and different problem. What I say is compatible with everything that happens, all the conscious life of the soul being determined by goings on in the brain. On the other hand, it's also compatible with the soul having a lot of freedom to independent of what happens in the brain. I don't think we know which is the case. I think there are some probabilistic arguments in favor of free will, but I don't think that they are in any way solve the issue. And it may well be that future neuroscience here will crucially help. It may show that the brain simply isn't a deterministic system. I'm inclined to think that that's what it will show, but I may be mistaken.
Okay, now I will give the question of Alfred's question. Do you want to? Alfred, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I will try to start the video. Thank you for letting me pose a question. I want to go back, if you will, to the example you mentioned about Alexandra. Alexandra's left half of her brain being transplanted to the body of Sandra, and the other half being transplanted to the body of Alex. And suppose that in some future time there will be possible such transplantations and they will be successful, so that the former Sandra and the former Alex both are persons being able to walk around and react to the world, etc. What is your solution to the puzzle about the souls of Sandra, Alexandra, and Alex? Will the soul of Alexandra go to Sandra or to Alex or to neither of them or to both of them?
Well, my crucial answer is I don't know, but it's just because I don't know that I am for, because I don't know, and I still wouldn't know if I know everything that's happened about their brain and their memories and so on, that I am forced to postulate that there is an indivisible non-material part which determines their identity. But I don't know which way it will go. No. I mean, what is not possible is that they're both Alexandra, because if they were both Alexandra, they would be having the same thoughts and feelings, and they won't. They go out of the room by different doors and have different lives. There's only three possibilities: that Alex is, that Sandra is, or that neither are. But assuming that they're both conscious beings, then, of course, if Sandra is Alexandra, then the whole process must have created a new soul. And conversely, if it's the other way around. But of course, it may be the case that both of them are new persons. I don't know, and no experiment is going to show me the answer. But that very fact is my reason for believing that it must be something non-physical that is responsible and something indivisible that is responsible.
Yeah. About the souls of Sandra and Alex themselves, they will not be in those bodies anymore after the removal of both brain halves. So they will be both dead?
Sorry, we take Alexandra and we take her left hemisphere and put it into Alex's body, from which we have taken out the original one.
Yeah.
We take the right hemisphere and put it in Sandra's body, from which we have taken out the original one. We connect it up and we suppose that both are conscious. Now, what were you suggesting was a problem at that stage?
No, I was just wondering if I understood you well, that both the original soul of Sandra and the original soul of Alex,
I see, yeah,
had left their bodies, or maybe stopped.
Well, we don't know. We just don't know. But if I see, yes, if it's Alex who is Alexandra, then the original Alex no longer exists.
Yeah.
And conversely, it was Sandra. That must be right. But of course, if Alex is not Alexandra, then presumably, but not necessarily, I got it slightly wrong before, presumably, but not necessarily, Alex is still there. It's still Alex, but it may not be still Alex. It may be a new person. The whole thing may have, as it were, produced a new person, but we don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of perplexing, I think.
Yes, of course, but it's what my argument forces us into, but I'd like to think you have to find the fallacy in the argument. Unless, I mean,
what about the possibility? Is there also the possibility that Sandra, having received half of Alexandra's functioning brain, still is Sandra, still keeps the soul of Sandra, but has to deal with the memories and
yes.
I don't know.
Oh yes, well, I mean, pretty clearly in these cases, both of the resulting persons will claim initially to be Alexandra because they will have memories. But they will realize that something's gone wrong if they also have the memories produced by the other hemisphere, which suggests they are the original Alex or the original Sandra, and therefore they won't know who they are.
Yeah.
That's
I think-
unavoidable.
Yeah.
I know it's science fiction stuff, but it's not scientific fiction stuff altogether by any means, because these are serious possibilities. There are serious possibilities of, well, actual removal of hemispheres, and we know that doesn't make a great difference to the memory claims. Now, if that's practically possible, then plugging in another part should seem even less impossible. And then there you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's still kind of puzzling. Because if the soul remains in one half of the brains, it's difficult to imagine what would happen to the other half of the brain, which is also still functioning. But as you mentioned, maybe there will be a completely new person then.
Well, that is possible. But I mean, it's either the original Alexandra, in which case the original Alex has ceased to exist, which is, I mean, not an impossible result of these strange goings on that somebody should cease to exist, or it's Alex continues to exist with a number of false memories. That surely is possible. So these alternatives are describable.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Okay, Per, we lost you for a second, so now it's your turn to ask a question.
Sorry, whose turn?
Okay. I have nothing to say about your argument. I just would love to hear what your coming book will contain more than this chapter.
Well, it's come.
It's come already. It's here.
2019. Oh, well, this chapter was chapter 3 and 4. Was followed by the chapter was largely concerned with showing that the soul is a necessary part of us. Only very briefly at the end did I give an argument, which I think was a bit brief, and I know was a bit brief, that it was a sufficient condition. That is, that we could, that logically possible, we could exist without a soul. And Descartes famously gave an argument for that. You know, I can conceive of myself without my body, therefore I don't exist. Therefore, my body is not necessary for me. And Descartes' argument is very unfashionable. All sorts of philosophers dismiss it in chapter 1 of their book about mind, brain identity. But I think with a little small alteration, the argument is correct, and the conclusion follows. So chapter 4 is to show that Descartes is right. And then there is a chapter after that which considers the most cogent argument against Descartes' argument. Descartes' argument goes by saying, I can conceive that I exist, etc. But opponents say, we don't know what the word I refers to, they say, and therefore we are not in a position to say, I can conceive this, because I don't know what it is that I am conceiving about. And I think we do know what it is, and therefore I distinguish two kinds of designators, that's words that pick out either substances or properties, and I call one class of them informative designators and the other class of them uninformative designators. And an informative one is one that if you know what the word means, then you know what in the context it's being used it refers to. and an uninformative one is one of which that is not the case. Now, for example, if you take the, I won't talk at great length of the, but at any rate, there are words like green or square or something that if you know what they mean, then you know what you're saying about something. Because you know what, when you say this is square, you know not merely what the word square means, but you know of anything you see whether or not it is square. And I want to say that's an informative designator, and there are informative designators of substances, and I want to say that the word I is just such a designator, because if I know what it means, and obviously I know what it means in an ordinary sense, then I know what it's referring to. Now, an informative designator is such that if we know what it means, we know what it's referring to, or rather, if we know what it means, we know what it is referring to when it is being used in such a way that we are best positioned for recognizing whether it applies, if our faculties are in working order, and if we are not subject to illusion. That is to say, for most words, it is the case that although we may recognize when they apply, we won't recognize in all cases whether they apply or not, because we may be subject to illusions, we may not be properly positioned, and so on. And I then point out that we cannot be mistaken in using the word I about whether someone who uses, if I say I am in pain, I cannot be subject to an illusion because an illusion would consist in supposing that I think I am in pain when it's really someone else, or conversely. And my faculties are in working order when I use this word I, and I am positioned as close as I can be when I am describing an experience of mine. So I'm arguing that I is an informative designator because we always know whether what we are referring to is I or whether it isn't when we are using it in referring to items in our mental life. And that means that we know the logically necessary and sufficient conditions for being that thing. It is for being the thing which we can recognize in those conditions. Now, that is a very brief and I'm sure not altogether easy to follow account. But what the point of this chapter is to say that a normal objection doesn't work. Because I is the sort of word that we do know what we're referring to when we use it, and so we know what we know that we can conceive of ourselves bodily. I then go on in chapter 6 to argue that not merely does brain goings on affect our mental life, but conversely, that is to say, there is continuous interaction between body and soul, and that means that goings on in the brain are affected by, caused by events not in the brain, and that is anathema to the average physicalist. But I think the arguments for this are very strong, and I claim to show in this chapter that any experiment which tried to show the contrary would in fact assume what they are trying to disprove. And then I go on in chapter 7 to consider the question of when the soul comes into existence, which we mentioned earlier, which sort of beings have souls, that is to say, what are the criteria for animals having souls, and whether some of them do and some of them don't. And then I come on finally to argue that the difference between my soul and your soul is not the body with which it is connected, there is a causal, accidental connection, nor does it have any property which makes it mine. It could be that there is another soul which has all the same properties as mine and yet isn't me. There could have been someone who lived my life and said just the same things as I say and talked to you in the same way and so on, but it wasn't me. And what makes me, my soul, therefore, is something not a separate property and not where it is. It's something intrinsic to it. It has its own, as I would say, getting a term from Duns Scotus, it has thisness, haikeitas. It's just what it is, and that's what it is. And my conclusion is, of course, that in that case, science could never explain the evolution of souls, because science relies on generalizations about things of this sort produce things of this sort. But okay, there could be a generalization saying fetuses of this sort produce souls of this sort, sure, but it wouldn't say whether the soul of this sort was me or somebody else. And that's, yeah, that was a rather short and summary of what's quite
Thank you very much. I will order it, but now that
well,
Professor Swinburne, are you all right? Are you exhausted from questions and lecturing?
But the time has come.
Sort of. We could take few short questions, but we don't have to. We can end here and then.
Well, 2 or 3 brief questions, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay. Caio Cesar is the next one. Sorry, I couldn't tell. Are you here with us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, please.
Firstly, greetings, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. I have some few questions for you. Correct me if I understood you wrongly, but you said that science says children start to have consciousness after some months. Consider this statement is right, and that consciousness is a prompt of soul. Does it suggest an entailment to an emergent theory of mind? A second, according to Catholicism, animals do have souls.
No, one question at a time, please.
Sorry.
No. The soul is called, I'm happy with the notion that a soul is caused to exist by a certain state of the fetus, but it couldn't be the whole explanation of the existence of me, because it doesn't explain why the soul, which is, and it couldn't explain for the reason I've just given, it couldn't explain why that the fetus will produce a soul of a certain sort, but what it can't explain is why that fetus of that soul of a certain sort is me rather than my double, and something else has to explain that. Either it's a chance matter, or religious answer is it's God who determines that in the end that I come into existence, even though the laws, no doubt God produced, operate. Something else is necessary beyond the laws.
Thank you. another question is,
Can we take, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have to be very short. Unless it's really like a connecting question, I would have to take another question.
I'm sorry.
It's not a connected?
No.
Okay. Okay. So we have Christos.
Hi, and my apologies for joining late. I wanted to ask whether you see the soul more as a sort of principle of independent determination. And here, there's obviously the, I don't mean sort of, living independently without sort of psychic or material kind of sustenance, but I mean sort of to be able to go against ourselves, to, want to pee, but not pee, or, this sort of going against our natures, if you'd like, or something of that sort. Or whether, sorry?
The soul is me. But of course, we have conflicting desires. Our desires, our nature, as you put it, our character consists of our desires and beliefs and so on, but they are properties of our souls. And of course, we have conflicting desires, and we have to decide between them. And it's we who decide between them, but they are properties of us. They are not things that exist on their own.
Sure. In that case, is it more of a locus of deciding, I guess, or sort of independent determination, or is it more of a locus of enlivening? So does it partake in creating, if you'd like, all these rich metabolic kind of differences and conflicting desires, as you say?
Yes, I mean, we are influenced by our brains, we are influenced by environment and so on, and we get different influences from different places, and we ourselves can help to form our characters by suppressing certain influences and deciding to yield to other influences.
Okay, and in that sense, does this have consequences for understanding the status of fetuses or young children? For example, in certain Roman times, you'd have to turn 2 or 3 years old or something like that to be deemed as a citizen or as a sort of a human being rather than livestock. Or, in other places, fetuses, any harm to the fetus is absolutely inconceivable as an intent to harm life. Or in other places, harming animals, for example, or even plants, people just take shoots off the plant. So I was just curious, where does your theory draw the line, if you'd like, on life?
Well, what I've said in this paper is quite compatible with a number of different views about that point. But what you are asking is not really whether who has souls. And I think my argument has the consequence that any being which is conscious has a soul, and therefore I think in view of the similarities of their brains and behavior to ourselves, what we call the higher animals, the vertebrates, probably have souls. I'm happy with that, but I don't think there's any reason to suppose invertebrates do, because their brains are so different, and all we know about our only grounds for supposing anything has a soul is that it's produced by something like what produces souls in me, viz. My brain. And if someone doesn't have that sort of brain, there's no reason for supposing that it's other than a robot. So that's what have souls. But some souls may be, as it were, more worth keeping in existence than other souls. And I think there are radical differences between normal humans and the higher animals, in that normal humans are capable of moral beliefs and free choice. And I don't think the higher animals are capable of these things. Now, of course, I may be wrong about that, but I don't think so. And also, I don't think animals have any sense of planning for the distant future, as it were, which humans do. And therefore, it's longing for continuing life is not something which they do. They just automatically react to circumstances in which they find themselves. And therefore, you're not depriving them of a desire, a satisfaction or a desire, if you kill them. And also, they are not, don't have the sacredness that something which has free choice and moral beliefs does. So I'm inclined to think that the mere fact they have consciousness isn't enough reason for supposing that you shouldn't kill them.
Thank you. I think that there might be some arguments to be made both for moral life and sort of like a continuity for animals, and also against, if you'd like, a moral feeling in young children. So, but
yeah,
thank you very
the
much.
young children have the capacity under normal circumstances to grow that to having a moral life. If they don't, then there is indeed something seriously wrong with them.
I think, well, I think, there's quite a lot of young children with learning disability, for example, that probably don't. And also, there are indications of certain animals that do show a very, what we would call moral capacity and moral actions, if you'd like, and collective actions.
On the first, you describe it as a disability, that is to say, something's gone wrong with their normal development. And what is sacred about a human baby who hasn't yet developed moral beliefs is that that's what they will do, and they are being preserved for what they will be able to do. I don't accept the view that animals have moral beliefs. To have a moral belief is to believe that something is morally obligatory, which you do not want to do and do not have any inclination to do. And this is not just altruism; it's more than that. Of course, animals can, like other animals, dislike animals, feel loyalty to the tribe, etc., etc. But that's not a moral. Morals is having moral beliefs is believing that something matters very much, which you don't want to do and is not to your interest and not to the interest of the tribe. You feel a moral conflict, only when you feel that sort of contact. And I don't see any evidence that animals do that, unless you do. But if you do, well, I change my view.
Yeah, I'll see if I can send some stuff about stealing and other things another time.
Okay, thank you, Christos. I would like to conclude this session. You can post your questions and comments here in the chat, or you can have it in a separate email to me, and then I will forward it to Professor Swinburne, if you like. But our time is up, and Professor is tired, I think. So I would like to conclude this session and thank you all for your presence, for your questions. I would like to especially thank our guest, Professor Swinburne, for such a exciting and very well argued paper. and invite you all to read his relatively newly published book under the same title. So thank you all, and our next webinar session will be on the September 16th. So stay with us, and we'll inform you through our regular emails, monthly emails. So yes, that's all from me. If anything wants to add, anything, Jair, Ricardo?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your questions. And I've been very glad to try to answer them.
Thank you, Professor Swinburne.
Thank you.